I want to thank all of you folks for putting together the PDW and to opt for what Dan Lerner, Dimo Demoff, and I had put together in a 2018 JBV to give a very, very shameless pitch for that one, is to be able to take a look at the extent to which entrepreneurial action is a consequence of all the different, the broadest conceivable spectrum of motivators and proclivities that exist in normal human life. And there's a tendency to over romanticize entrepreneurial action for a lot of reasons. One of them is because it's exciting. It is the kind of thing for which we attach accomplishments with specific people. And so there's a tendency to look at it with a certain air of celebrity that comes with it. But the biggest thing is we look at it retrospectively. And so together with Wim Van Lent and Dan Lerner and I, Dan and I have teamed up on a great bit of this literature, is that this retrospective and ex post analysis and storytelling of entrepreneurial action is one that involves lots of censoring, that literally what we call it in the articles we prepared is narrativity. And when narrativity is this idea that you create a narration, and the more times you tell a story, the more it ends up sounding as though it's in a straight line. When we know that entrepreneurial thinking and action, and especially very, very nascent stage thinking, contemplation, or in particular actions that may or may not be deliberate and highly judgmental in the decision-making process, that it's extremely messy, and it's no different from the rest of human life. And so on these sorts of decisions that one makes about entrepreneurship, the question is it a consequence of action that's already taken, or is the action in response to decisions that have been made? And it always seems, and folks try to blur that line in order to be able to elevate the role of rationality. But that's a real curiosity to me, because rationality is a tool like any other tool. And sometimes it's extremely appropriate and sometimes it's not. And but what we'd want to emphasize with this is that the presence of non-deliberative or less judgmental, less rational modes of entrepreneurial action are not necessarily good or bad, that there are times when it's really, really bad to be impulsive. There are other times, though, when things are quite ill-formed, that impulsivity is not only advisable, it's not even really a decision point. It's not a question of whether it should or shouldn't exist. It does exist because we're human beings. And I'm disappointed to a certain extent that some of the efforts that we've done, even in non-human entrepreneurship, hasn't gotten more traction, because in addition to being lots and lots of other things, including killing off the planet, that we are also animals. And that there are common threads that run through all of those. And we can actually, in smaller societies, where we can hone in on some of the micro aspects of creativity and behaviors and innovations in non-humans, it breaks away all of society just down to its barest bones, almost the DNA of innovation. And so when we do that, we see that this idea of there being primarily deliberative, judgment-based, rational decision-making becomes a little bit silly, that we do lots and lots and lots of stuff in terms of emitting behavior, and then we get response, and we respond in association with that. And so in my opinion, this is just injecting a high degree of veridicality. And veridicality is an underused word, which means veridical is that which resembles reality. And there's something called the veridical paradox. Veridical paradox is something that seems preposterous and impossible, but it's actually true. And so in this case, we've dressed up entrepreneurship as this formal, inevitable process. And everybody says, oh, sure, entrepreneurship is a journey and these things. Well, what journey doesn't have emotion and affect and mistakes and falling on your face, the idea of a face plant and stuff like this to it? And everybody just says, oh, well, that's just part of learning. I said, okay. But you're stripping away a lot of what it means to be human to just hone in on the highly rational facets of it. And there are times when a high degree of rationality and deliberative decision-making is the key to success. But the fact is that that's not what people solely rely upon. And so from our view, this is just having a huge scholarly picnic when everyone's finally invited. We're bringing all of the human beings to the picnic basket. And to me, that's all that's interesting. Let's not dress it up to something that it's not. Thank you very much for the question. I've already tipped my cap a little bit to the non-human entrepreneurship, for which huge number of the people show up. That when I'm asked to give public addresses to non-scholarly audiences, that's the most popular topic for me to present on. I enjoy it. There's a great book that are humans smart enough to know to interpret the intelligence of non-humans? And the answer is, well, probably not. That this is a growing area that becomes fascinating because it strips away a lot of the social artifacts and scaffolding that disguise more of what people do. We do things because we're bored. We do things out of certainly impulsivity, out of biological necessity in some instances. And so it's fascinating to look at that. And so lots of people attend, but people are repulsed, frankly speaking, by the notion of taking entrepreneurship and said, well, entrepreneurship is something that people do. And we're going to add these many layers of a rational interpretation for it. And so what we're also taking a look at then is to build upon the JBV, that's the article focus on action, and that action oftentimes precedes forethought. In fact, overwhelming number of times it does, even on biological necessity. And we're doing some work now to try to challenge what we call the rationality assumption. I've said again and again that if entrepreneurship had been born from psychology instead of economics, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. Everybody would say, oh yeah, we understand extremely well that human beings have a vast array of predilections, proclivities, particular tendencies, that the neurodiversity movement, not just in terms of psychiatric conditions, but for every individual, the neurodiversity invites this kind of perspective. What makes it interesting for me, and I am a non-psychologist, and I co-author with folks who are psychologists, and that what brings me to the table then really is this idea of impossibility, that the idea that entrepreneurship is way too interesting to glamorize it as being something that has a certain inevitability to it, and that they're really smart people who are successful, and they are somehow radically differentiated from the others, and they have these amazing insights that then they proceed with in rational fashion. And so there are a number of things in that area that what the reason is that people have taken a look at hypomania. Marcus Wolf, great work on that with a couple of co-authors recently. And of course, there's just an avalanche of work on ADHD. Part of the reason people focus on this is that it's indisputably a diagnosable clinical condition that you can identify. And so all of us, you have neurodiversity for me and versus others. And so the question is, how do we corral that? How do we start to study it? Well, unless you can identify a population, it's very difficult to look at it longitudinally or even in a cross section. And so you'll have people like Roy Turek, Ingrid Verhul, who we've co-authored with our paper for AMP on dueling banjos that takes a look at the entire entrepreneurial life cycle in this regard. But you got Holger, Isabella, Man Ling, of course, Jan Vicklin is on many papers in this, and just a terrific voice on these areas. And a lot of these folks then are using clinical conditions like ADHD because it's readily identifiable. So the idea is, let's go out and build some empirical basis for understanding how this plays its way out. Well, not surprisingly, there are some trends that have become apparent, and then some things that are just white noise with all of this. But most of human endeavor involves some of these sorts of things. And so a lot of what we're looking at with this then is to say that there are many different tools to entrepreneurial action, and rationality is just one of those tools. Sometimes it's highly advisable, sometimes it's underutilized. The other thing that I want to talk about is this idea of the 7 phases of the entrepreneurial life cycle that we developed. And the idea that at every single one of these phases that an assortment of tools are necessary. And so that's why typically founding teams and highly diverse founding teams are more successful than individuals or highly homogenous founding teams. And so I'm very struck with the notion that nature wants biodiversity, and it's messier that way. It appears to be messy, but there's an underlying genius to it. The same thing is with diversity among founding teams. That every study on brainstorming has shown that when you have a high degree of homophily among the group, the love of sameness, that it's much, much more efficient and they have more quick hits and immediate wins. But over the long term, you suffocate the group by not having the rich diversity. It's exactly the same as the planet, that over the long, it seems very efficient. We're developing society, and that we meet the various financial and non-financial goals of artificial imperatives of being humans. But bit by bit, we're suffocating the planet because we're reducing the amount of biodiversity. It seems like it's just an analogy then to pull this into entrepreneurship, and it's not. I think it's literally true that the love of sameness or the idea of a rejection of diversity with this is extremely dangerous. And that's what this really comes down to from my view as an evolutionary thinker on these facets. And so a lot of the work we're doing conceptually and also taking a look at with respect to empirical work is to come back and to really dig into this notion that to not embrace the idea of a broad spectrum set of drivers for entrepreneurial action, that ultimately you suffocate firms, sectors, and the marketplace more broadly. The most fascinating examples that I've seen of non-human entrepreneurship lately is that there was an adolescent female chimpanzee, and she was a real rascal. And what she did is she took these long reeds, that tall grass, and she would take 2 of them about the same size, and she would put them in her ears, and they would stick out. And there's no function to it whatsoever. It was just a decoration. And because she had a real type A personality, a lot of the other teenage or adolescent chimpanzees wanted to copy her, but they didn't know how to do it. It's very painful to put a reed into your ear. And so she would teach them, or she would do it for them, and they started walking around just like teenagers, perhaps with music or a cultural fad, or dressing a particular way, or tattoos, or piercing, or something of that nature. And the idea that it grew. And so, from a standpoint, in the work we put together, we look at 6 different kinds of entrepreneurship, including institutional, social entrepreneurship, and then also cultural entrepreneurship. So what was interesting is after this female chimpanzee passed away, chimpanzees, even in nearby valleys that ended up taking on this particular kind of behavior. And so it didn't extinguish, just at that particular juncture. And so there are some fascinating ones. And so with your German Shepherds and some other examples, that if people just slow down and observe other species, it's just jaw-dropping in terms of some of the insights you see. And so is it literally taking a currency? Well, no, they have 2 tiny fungible storage of value like currency. And so it's ridiculous to compare the 2. There has to be a different test for that. But if we're saying at the very early stage of entrepreneurial action, or action that becomes entrepreneurship, it would be the equivalent of saying that I'm only really parenting if I'm rational. Well, most of being a parent to human children involves all kinds of emotions and tiredness, exhaustion, happiness, exuberance. And so there's so many other things that come into play. And so the research that we've been trying to do, and the non-human ones, is just really provocative. And so I love to get in people's face about that as an example. But a big part of it also is for us to take a deep breath and understand that human beings are a lot less unique than we think. And we know from a DNA perspective, the percentage overlap between certain species is almost as great as it is between Homo sapiens and one other. So I love your story, and I love anyone's story on those angles. terms of the future, I think that there is going to be a real opportunity to take a look at the ways and to better test the 7 phases of the entrepreneurial life cycle, and to try to see at what points and in what ways rational forethought and highly deliberative judgment-based decision making is underutilized or overutilized, or when you need to have supplements to that. And to just be real forthright that the idea of the rationality assumption just isn't useful. That the idea that it is a gating process for a determination that you're now commencing action that will result in entrepreneurial activity, or that we artificially link it and say all human activity has rational underpinnings to it. There's just no other field that's saying any such thing. And everybody tips their cap a little bit to prospect theory, Kahneman and Tversky, and the big debate with Giger Renzer. But even all of those kinds of things, and in some ways even Herbert Simon's bounded rationality is still fundamentally based on rationality and deliberative thinking. It's just a set of heuristics and biases and the boundedness that accompanies the rational decision-making process. What we would say is that even that is only a tiny subset of all of what involves a broad spectrum approach to any human endeavor, and certainly something as complex and socially embedded as entrepreneurial action would be among those. And so a chance to take a look at the various phases, and to understand when and how entrepreneurial action is motivated and guided by, and perhaps even most precipitated by, less deliberative approaches, and including, of course, impulsivity, irrationality or non-rationality, and the drivers that are associated with them. Most of the focus really has been on market entry with these things, and that folks have gotten hung up on the idea of how do you impulsively enter the market. Say, well, that's the wrong way to look at it. That oftentimes we end up having lots and lots. It's as though there's a single decision that is made, and either going to do, and that again, it's part of this process of overly romanticizing the entrepreneurial process. And by over romanticizing it, it's not as from a standpoint of adoration, but from a standpoint of empowering it or imbuing it with a perspective as though it is this transcendent moment, when in fact most folks begin part-time. They chip away at something with an idea. They have lots of twists and turns to it. But my point is that it's not even just the market entry that ends up having a high degree of impulsivity, that even day to day, hour to hour, that there is a manifold respects in which individuals and teams engage in all kinds of impulsivity in the operations of entrepreneurial ventures, and that those also play a key role. And I don't think that we're very good at being able to observe decision-making by alternative pathways. As you're well aware, Anna, that one of the difficulties we've had is people talking about non-rational logics or things. So we have to get rid of the word logics. And so what we're really working on now too, and the future directions, is what is the vocabulary that because it's an outgrowth of entrepreneurship, of economics, entrepreneurship is so heavily burdened with this idea of analytical logics. And that's oftentimes really, really important. So our vocabulary really sucks in this regard, and nobody's really taking that up to try to understand it. We need a lot more mixture between people who have a psychology background and an econ strategy background. And so for me, that I am, as I mentioned, and not in reality and not on TV and not on the street corner am I a psychologist. And so I've sought to team up with folks like Dan and Johan and Demo and so many others to be able to break down these barriers, because the barriers are really silly. To say somebody's micro or macro or something of this nature, it's all based on three things that Per Davidson has always pounded on. That good entrepreneurship research needs to be able to contemplate the process. That there's an entrepreneur, fundamentally it is a human process. And whether it's McMullen and Demoff's work on entrepreneurship as a journey, which everybody should read and love and know, it's a process. Secondarily, it's multi-level, that it is impossible to understand it by a single level of analysis. And then third, fundamentally, there's massive heterogeneity, both in terms of initiating the ensuing process, the 7 phases, and the outcomes. And so a lot lot of this then is taking those up with some earnestness. The good news is this is great for the field, that all of us have lots and lots and lots of work to do the rest of the time. And it is super exciting. In this regard, more and more folks are focused on what we consider to be these non-deliberative or less deliberative entrepreneurial alternative pathways. And from a standpoint of neurodiversity, it's really quite a no-brainer in this regard. It's only a part of what I do in all of my research, and yet it's one that I come back to again and again, surprised that in some ways there's still pushback at all on this. But all of us can and should love a great debate, and to me, it starts to seem more and more like settled science that we have a broad spectrum of drivers. But there are still folks who want to say no. Before it formally becomes entrepreneurship, there needs to be some kind of rational, judgmental, deliberative process. And I would say, wow, if that's true, then it is the only human activity that necessarily subscribes to those constraints. And so I'm not going to cave in on that. And instead, I'm going to go over and just watch your German shepherds do interesting things. And so we get there. But